All right, Genesis chapter 12. And I'm going to have to read this text like Jimmy Johnson running the race. So you hold on. Genesis chapter 12. I'm going to begin in verse 10. I'm going to read through chapter 13, verse 13. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to live there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was getting near to Egypt, he said to Sarah his wife, I know you're a beautiful woman, therefore when the Egyptians see you, they will say this is his wife. So will then kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I may be treated well for your sake. Then my life will be spared because of you. So when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarah was beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. She was taken into Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake, and he had sheep and livestock, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Abram's wife Sarah. So Pharaoh called Abraham and said, What have you done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now here's your wife. Take her and leave. Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away and his wife and all that he had. Chapter 13. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him. Abram was very wealthy in livestock and silver and in gold. He continued on his journey from Negev and came to Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he first made an altar. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land was not able to support them both dwelling together because their possessions were great. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites dwelled in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, Let there be no strife, I ask you, between me and you, between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you will go to the left, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right, then I will go to the left. Lot lifted up his eyes and looked at all the valley of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go to Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Then Lot chose for himself the entire valley of the Jordan and journeyed east, and two of them separated each other. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the valley and pitched his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinners against the Lord. I titled the message this morning, The School of Faith. The School of Faith. God schooled Abraham. Begin with the quote from Amy Carmichael, who was a missionary to India. She said this, Life can be difficult. Sometimes the enemy comes in like a flood. But then is the time to prove our faith and live our songs. Life can be like that coat of many colors, can't it? So as Christians, as believers, we need to understand that our faith is going to be tested.
True.
Somebody said, a faith that can't be tested can't be trusted. So God allows trials. God allows testings to come into our lives for the purpose of not only verifying our faith to us, not to God. God knows all about our faith. God knows the strength of our faith. It's we who don't know the strength of our faith. And so testings and trials are verification to you and I, not only that our faith is real, but to also increase and strengthen our faith, as well as to purify us. God knows what kind of faith we have. You and I, sometimes we may think that we know. We may think that we know, but in reality we don't. Given any set of circumstances that you and I might face in life, God knows what each of us would do in any given circumstance. We may think we know, but we really don't. The only way that you and I can advance in the school of faith is to take tests, to undergo examination. And so as we progress, just as Abraham had to progress in the school of faith, we find ourselves just like Abraham in our text this morning. Abraham found himself facing 3 specific tests. 3 specific tests. Abraham was tested by circumstances. He was likewise tested by people. And then he was tested by things. Circumstances, people, and things. That pretty much runs the gamut, doesn't it? So in our text here, Abraham, God puts Abraham to the test. Now we know that Abraham was a great man of faith. But do you understand that sometimes Abraham failed the test?
Exactly.
That ought to encourage you and I this morning. Abraham was a great man of faith, yet as a human being, just like you and I, he didn't always pass the test. Sometimes he failed.
We do.
So I want to get this point across to you this morning. The test of our faith is instrumental in our walk with God. The testing of our faith is instrumental in our walk with God. Now, the first thing we can see here in this story regarding Abraham is this. God uses various circumstances in the testing of our faith. Abraham's first big test after leaving the land of Ur, his first great test was a famine that came upon the land. Remember, God called Abraham in the land of Ur. Abraham took a step of faith. He left the land of Ur and left much of his family behind. That is when Abraham and Sarah began their journey of faith. You and I began our journey of faith the moment we invited Christ into our lives. That's when our journey of faith began. And so Abraham and Sarah, they began their journey of faith. Now, just use your imagination with me a bit this morning. Would you suspect that, like all couples, perhaps Abraham and Sarah had this dream of settling down and making a home for themselves. But God had other plans. Sometimes our plans, folks, don't always correspond with God's plans.
We don't know.
Building a new home and settling down was not in God's plan for Abraham and Sarah. Instead, what did they do? They found themselves in the midst of a famine. And so that leads us to a question. Abraham has obeyed God. He's taken this big step of faith. He's left everything behind him. Why would God allow such a circumstance to come into his life?
It's his faith.
To befall him? God was teaching Abraham a lesson. And he was schooling Abraham in the school of faith. That's a lesson you and I need to learn as well, folks.
Always.
This lesson applies to every one of us.
Amen. It's true.
And that lesson is this: test and examinations will often follow the triumphs and the victories in our lives. Expect the enemy to pay you a visit after you've experienced a victory in your life. He's not going to let you celebrate too long, folks. He's going to attack us if we seek to be faithful to God. And it's really the only way that you and I can grow in our faith. That's why God allows it. I would suggest to you that Job was a much stronger man in his faith when he came out of that storm than he was when he went into it. Job learned some valuable lessons in the school of faith. And so God uses difficult circumstances of life in order to grow our faith. But all too often, what do we wish to do when the circumstances come into our lives which we don't like? Our first normal response is to do what? Run.
That's right. Go away from it.
But the fact is, running away from our problems never works, folks. When we run from our problems, we only create more problems and more trouble for ourselves.
They follow us.
And that is exactly what Abraham did when he found himself in the famine. He ran. Where did he run to? Egypt. When the famine came, Abraham, get this, he didn't just run to Egypt, he ran down to Egypt. That's what the scripture says. He ran down to Egypt. And as he ran down to Egypt, things began to run downhill for Abraham from that moment. You see, Egypt is a symbol of this world system. Egypt is a symbol of bondage, of slavery. While Israel, on the other hand, is a symbol or a picture of blessing. Abraham ran to the world for help when the famine came, and he ran down and he went down. You see, it's circumstances. Circumstances often may lead us into the furnace of testing. And I'll tell you what, Abraham had his test in Egypt, my friend. Circumstances may lead us into the furnace of testing. Here's a lesson here. It's best to stay put until God moves us.
Amen.
You see, it's faith. Faith will always move in the direction of peace and hope.
Amen.
That's true.
While unbelief,
Uh-oh, that's the
I
direction.
tell you what unbelief will lead you. Unbelief will lead you into a land of restlessness and fear. And that's where Abraham found himself in Egypt.
That's right.
In restlessness and fear. You see, when those difficult circumstances come to us, one of the first things you and I want to ask is, how can I get out of this?
True.
Why would you want to get out of a circumstance that God has put you in? Do you understand that God is in control of every circumstance? Rather than asking ourselves, how can I get out of this circumstance? Perhaps we should ask ourselves, what can I get out of this circumstance?
Exactly.
What can I learn in this circumstance? How can I grow in this circumstance? How can my faith be strengthened in this circumstance? One of the great lessons of life that you and I need to learn, folks, is that understand that God is in control. If we are His children, God is in control of the circumstances that come into our lives.
Exactly. Everything. Amen. But we don't seem
And we're always safer in His will rather than being out of His will.
Amen.
We would be better off living in the circumstance of a famine in the will of God than we would be out there running in the world outside the will of God.
Amen.
true.
God uses various circumstances in the testing of our faith. And the testing of our faith is instrumental in our walk with God. The second thing I want us to see here is this. God will often use people to test your faith.
That's right. Amen. Amen.
I tell you, people will try you, boy.
We'll keep on.
People will push you to the edge, won't they?
Exactly.
People will try their patience, won't they? So, God will often use people in the testing of our faith. So what did Abraham do? Abraham ran from one circumstance to another. He ran from the famine, he ran smack down into Egypt into another circumstance. He ran from one mess into another mess. He got down into Egypt, and what did he find? Another problem. You know, today, It was even true in my day. When students fail in school, they often just drop out. I have news for you. God doesn't allow any dropouts in His school of faith, folks.
Amen.
In Canaan, Abraham had to deal with the circumstance of the famine. But he ran. And when he ran and he got down into Egypt,
It was worse.
rather than having to deal with the famine, now he had to deal with a proud ruler and a bunch of wicked officers. People.
Got worse.
He probably scratched his head and said, I wish I'd have stayed in the famine before it was all over with. Huh?
Too late then, again.
He'd been better off dealing with the circumstances in the land of Canaan, rather than the people in Egypt, that worldly bunch that he found himself having to deal with. And what happened when Abraham moved down
Got worse.
in Egypt? Abraham moved from trusting God in Canaan to becoming a schemer in Egypt. That's what happens, folks, when we stop trusting God. When we stop trusting God, we start leaning on the arm of the flesh. When we stop trusting God, we start relying on the world out there.
Wrong place.
You see, what happened was Abraham and Sarah, when they left the land of Ur, they carried a little of Ur with them. And they brought something called a half-truth out of Ur. Started scheming with those half-truths when they got down into Egypt. See, when we scheme in an effort to escape our problems with people, just like Abraham did, what's going to happen? Worse problems are going to be forthcoming. Abraham moved from confidence to fear.
Degradation.
What happened when he got down there in Egypt? He got the line, didn't he? He said, oh, she's not my wife, my sister. And half-truth that come out of her. Why did he lie? Fear.
Scared. Exactly.
He got out of the will of God. He got the line. Became fearful. Instead of fearing God, he's now fearful of man. He took his eyes off the Lord and he got to looking at man. And what was the result? You ever heard anybody? I've heard this said 1,000 times. I'm not hurting anybody but myself. Perhaps that's what Abraham thought. But what did Abraham do in his lying? In his scheming, he moved from bringing and being a blessing to people to bringing judgment upon people. You see, God had called Abraham to be a blessing to the nation.
He did later on, yeah.
But when he got caught up down in Egypt, and he got caught up in that old worldly, stinking thinking, when he got disobedient, what happened? He brought judgment on Pharaoh and Pharaoh's household. There's a lesson. In order to be a blessing, you and I have to stay in the will of God.
Amen.
Remember that fellow Jonah? Jonah did a similar thing, didn't he? Jonah ran from God. Jonah got out of the will of God, and the result was he almost sunk a ship full of people. Abraham. What happened to Abraham down in Egypt? What happened to Abraham down in the world? He lost his testimony to the world. That's what happened. How many professing Christians have you ever known in your life? They got back out there and they got to running with the world and they destroyed their testimony before.
Yeah, many.
We've seen it right here in this church. Hold on.
Oh, yeah.
What happened if you don't watch your step?
Yeah.
Abraham lost his testimony before Pharaoh and before Pharaoh's household for lying.
Pharaoh got rid of him too.
That's another lesson, folks.
Yeah.
There is I don't care who you are. There is always a price to pay for lying.
Exactly.
Amen.
We'll find you out.
For disobedience.
Right.
Now get this. Everything that Abraham received down in Egypt would later on in life bring him nothing but trouble. Bring him nothing but trouble.